Right, welcome everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today titled Examining Anti-Semitism 1 Year After Tree of Life. I'm Stephen Gardner. I'm an assistant research director at Political Research Associates. PRA is a social justice think tank. We do work that supports movements, research, and strategic analysis that promotes social justice and democratic inclusion. We expose and oppose movements of the right, including their institutions and ideologies. We support human rights, and we have a strong program opposing anti-Semitism and white nationalism in that context. Our executive director, Tarso Ramos, was meant to be the moderator this evening. I am standing in for him as he is out at a conference and having technical difficulties. So before I introduce our speakers, just very briefly, I'd like to thank our co-hosts for the webinar. That's Bend the Arc, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and United We Dream. We are very proud to be working with all of them and with all of you on the panel and on the call. Before we begin our presentations, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is 1 year yesterday that a white nationalist attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh tragically ended the lives of 11 people. I'm going to say their names in memory, followed by a moment of silence. Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Daniel Stein, Richard Gottfried, Joyce Feinberg, Melvin Wax, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, and Irvin Younger. May their memories be a blessing. Following that tragic event at Tree of Life a year ago, many people in movements and in the country were struggling to understand the white nationalist ideology that motivated this attack and brought deadly violence around the world to Christchurch, New Zealand, to El Paso, Texas, to Gilroy and Poway, California, and to Halle, Germany, among other places. Tonight, we're going to try to tease some of that out. We're going to look at the more mainstream manifestations under the current administration. We've witnessed the adoption of white nationalist ideas as national policy. President Trump's immigration policies are adapted almost without modification from the white nationalist playbook. At the same time, adjacent social movements of the right, from various sorts of religious nationalism to both pseudo-populist and plutocratic authoritarianism, have been emboldened on a global scale. In this webinar, we will hear from analysts and researchers, as well as organizers at both the national and local level. You'll have a chance to learn a little bit about PRA's new report, produced in partnership with Bend the Arc, taking aim at multiracial democracy, anti-Semitism, white nationalism, and anti-immigrant racism in the era of Trump. That's written by my colleague, Ben Lorber. And I encourage all of you who haven't to read it and to share it widely. We'll also lean into a vision of the future rooted in the belief that we must replace the wrong and cynical idea that for some groups to thrive, others must be dominated or expelled, with our conviction that we all rise or fall together. A few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. It will be made available for download later. The Zoom webinar Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen allows you to type a question. We hope to get to as many as possible starting around 8 p.m. Unfortunately, this feature is not available for those of you joining by phone. Now, in the interest of time, I will very briefly introduce our panelists and refer you to the registration email you received for more details. So tonight you're going to hear from Dov Kent, who's a senior strategy officer at Bend the Arc, from Grisa Martinez, Deputy Executive Director at United We Dream, Imogen Page, who's a staffer at Jewish Community Action in St. Paul, Alyssa Rubin, an organizer with Never Again Action, Brandon Mond, who's statewide organizer for Carolina Jews for Justice, and Ben Lorber, research analyst at Political Research Associates. I'm going to turn to Ben first. I'm going to ask him a couple of questions, and this is the way the format will be. I'll ask a question or two of each panelist. Sometime we'll go back to a panelist a second time. So Ben, thanks for being on. The new report that you wrote, Taking Aim at Multiracial Democracy, it links anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant racism in the actions of the mass shooter who attacked the Tree of Life synagogue 1 year ago. So tell us a little bit about that connection.
Thanks, Stephen. Can folks hear me okay? Yeah, great. So 1 year ago, when white nationalist Robert Bowers stepped into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, he first posted on social media, quote, "I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in." Bowers believed that by attacking Jews, he was defending his white race from immigrants. So where did this idea come from? White nationalists believe that massive non-white immigration is causing the great replacement of whites by non-whites in America, a crisis they call white genocide. This crisis, they believe, is accelerated by other progressive forces and a climate of multiculturalism, creating an existential threat where, in their eyes, in the course of a few generations, white people will essentially become extinct in America through becoming more and more of a demographic minority. The only way to preserve a future for the white race, in their eyes, is to create an all-white ethnostate where non-whites will be removed. Now, for white nationalists, they have to answer the question, how did this happen? How did the cards become so stacked against them? The answer, of course, for white nationalists is the Jews. For white nationalists, progressive US Jewish activists have worked for over a century to covertly orchestrate non-white immigration and a slew of progressive forces in America, from the civil rights movement to LGBTQ rights, to feminism, to political correctness on college campuses, etc. Now, of course, given their obsession with demographics, immigration is central to white nationalists. You know, white nationalist intellectuals like Kevin MacDonald have written that for over a century, they believe, American Jews have worked to loosen American immigration policies, you know, overturning the restrictive policies of the 20s and 30s and the 40s to open the floodgates of America to non-white immigration. White nationalists continue to believe that Jews today are leading efforts to let non-white immigrants into the country. So, you know, and according to white nationalists, they believe that Jews do this activism because there is hardwired into the Jewish people a group evolutionary strategy to survive in diaspora by weakening white majorities, therefore ensuring Jewish survival. That's a lot more complicated and crazy than that, but that's the various thing they believe. So therefore, in the white nationalist imagination, anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant racism are deeply intertwined, right? They believe the non-white immigrants, by simply existing in this country, pose a demographic threat to white people, and they blame Jews for orchestrating this threat. For white nationalists, you can think of it like Jews are the meta-enemy. Other groups might represent threats from below. For example, white nationalists and a lot of other white people in America believe that immigrants might be, you know, taking jobs, you know, competing economically. But Jews in the white nationalist imagination threaten the white race from above as the prime movers and puppet masters of creeping white genocide. Thus, according to white nationalist publisher Greg Johnson, quote, "The organized Jewish community is the principal enemy, not the sole enemy, but the principal enemy of every attempt to halt and to reverse white extinction." Now, white nationalism continues to be a growing threat. As we just heard, white nationalist mass shootings continue against Jews, Latinx folks, and other marginalized groups. And meanwhile, white nationalism enjoys an expanding potential base of support across the US landscape. Studies show that millions of white Americans hold a strong sense of white identity and victimization. And millions more also fear that the effects of the country becoming a racial plurality, or in other words, becoming majority non-white by 2045, as many census studies predict, will be mostly negative. So therefore, we should be very concerned that white nationalism may become more and more appealing to more and more segments of American society in the coming years and decades.
Thanks, Ben. I'm just going to ask you one more question. So in the report, it argues that there's a connection between anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant racism, and it's mobilized by the right-wing elected officials like Trump and media outlets like Fox News. Can you tell us about this mainstream connection and how anti-Semitism is used to further a political agenda?
Yeah, sure. So the events leading up to the Tree of Life shooting a year ago are a good illustration of how white nationalist anti-Semitism is mobilized by right-wing elected officials and media pundits alongside anti-immigrant racism, and how this endangers Jews and all communities. So in the weeks leading up to the 2018 midterms in early October or so, a conspiracy theory started to spread on the internet that liberal Jewish philanthropist George Soros was orchestrating a migrant caravan that at the time was gathering in Honduras and headed northwards, full of immigrants and refugees seeking safety, freedom from political repression, and a better life, right? Now, this conspiracy theory first incubated on the fringes of the right-wing internet until right-wing politicians and Fox News anchors began to uplift it to be viewed by an audience of millions. Politicians like Matt Gaetz, Louis Gohmert, and even Trump himself, tweeted or said on Fox that George Soros was in fact behind the migrant caravan. This conspiracy theory, mushroomed all across right-wing media, social media, so that by the time of Robert Bowers' shooting on October 27th, the idea that Soros was funding the migrant caravan had a potential reach of over 600 million on Facebook and Twitter alone. And Tree of Life shooter Robert Bowers himself posted frequently about Jews and the caravan in the days leading up to the attack. And this was far from the only anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that was spread in that time. PRA found that in these 2 months leading up to the midterms, Fox News and 5 other leading conservative websites published a combined total of at least 345 news pieces that connected Soros and globalists to liberal causes, almost one article a day per site on average. And this is part of a larger pattern. Over the last few years, Trump himself, as well as other right-wing leaders from Steve King, Trump Jr., Matt Gaetz, Kevin McCarthy, and others have scapegoated Soros or globalists as being behind, Black Lives Matter protests, being behind protests against the nomination of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, being behind, Democratic campaigns. Even recently, Trump Jr. has insisted that George Soros is behind impeachment proceedings against Trump, right? So it should be clear that when they say Soros and globalists, white nationalists hear Jews. This is a direct replica in slightly, coded form of the white nationalist, anti-Semitism that views Jews as the puppet masters of all progressive causes, all political and media institutions, etc. And when right-wing leaders, engage in this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, it serves as what we call scripted violence, right? Trump himself doesn't have to say explicitly if someone should go out and get those globalists, but a subset of his followers hears that message and takes it upon themselves to take action against the named enemy before it's too late. Not only that, this is a useful tool for right-wing leaders to build and consolidate their own power. It serves as a scaffolding for sweeping attacks against progressive movements. It serves as a flexible and a fear-driven frame with the power to mobilize millions behind a right-wing policy agenda, as millions of Americans are convinced that a whole spectrum of progressive causes represents the sinister, machinations of a parasitic elite. It bolsters the ultranationalist project, right? By framing this internal enemy, this, globalist elite, as the arch enemy of the America First mission. And finally, it corrodes democracy by convincing millions that social movements don't arise as organic expressions of real communities who are demanding rights and representation, but instead are engineered by this shadowy cabal. And finally, what right-wing anti-Semitism does is it preserves structures of racial and economic injustice. In our era of widespread inequality and instability, millions across our country are currently eager to challenge the power of the perceived societal elite. So populist movements that arise at this time can either be progressive or reactionary. At their best, progressive populist movements can offer a clear analysis of what's going on, a condemnation of the real societal elites who actually profit from exploitation, and a clear, plan of action to redistribute the goods of society for everyone. But reactionary populist movements, on the other hand, substitute a false revolt against a false elite. In our era, millions are energized at the appeal that by, punching up against Soros or globalists, they are draining the swamp, as Trump says, and challenging the powers that be. This resonates for many Americans who are fed up with widespread poverty, inequality, corrupt and unaccountable leadership, and other alienating ills of late capitalism. But of course, this is a false promise and a false elite, and it leaves the real sources of exploitation and inequality intact in our society. So this is why we at PRA believe very strongly that anti-Semitism is a real threat to Jews and should be opposed on that reason. And also, anti-Semitism is a real threat to progressive movements and to everyone in our country who seeks, safety and equality and justice.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to now turn to Dov Kent from Bend the Arc, and I'm going to ask her to tell us just a little bit about how Bend the Arc understands the threat of anti-Semitism today, and what is the role of Jews as well as non-Jews in opposing anti-Semitism?
Thanks, Stephen. So the threat of anti-Semitism is connected to the threat of all oppressions, and resisting anti-Semitism is fundamentally connected to resisting all oppressions. It's important to say that because any conversation about anti-Semitism that isolates its source from the fundamental building blocks of all oppression or isolates its resistance from the liberation of all peoples is intentionally misguiding us and confusing us. We need to be clear about that. We are not going to be able to fight the rise of current day anti-Semitism in the United States or elsewhere without fighting, one, the systems of white supremacy, Christian supremacy, and capitalism that underpin it, and two, the movement of white nationalism that has grown from the system of white supremacy, has reached the highest echelons of political power in our country, and is currently putting many of our communities at increased risk. So there's many different ways that we can choose to fight anti-Semitism. There is unfortunately a long history of Jews seeking safety by getting closer to power and hiding under the wings of powerful white Christian leaders. And while this has worked for periods, this has not been a long-term solution for our safety. There is, however, also a long history of Jews building deep solidarity with other targeted communities against fascist regimes and economic exploitation. And it is in this tradition that we must place ourselves today. So, as Ben just explained, anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant racism and xenophobia are not loosely connected as bad things in the world. They work together to tell a story. And it's a story about white people. And it's been written to say that immigrants are a threat to their way of life, and Jews are the fuel behind that threat. And as Ben noted, the Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue were not randomly chosen. They were identified as Jews who were participating in Hayes's campaign to welcome immigrants to our communities. So our communities are being threatened together, and our responses must be together. And under these political conditions, it's really important for us to make the connections between state violence and vigilante violence, because the right tries its hardest to separate them. So we know that it's the same white nationalist ideology that results in targeting immigrant families at the border through state violence and targets Jews in synagogues through vigilante violence. The right would like us to believe that the latter is a lone wolf phenomenon that has nothing to do with state policies. And so it's our job to keep connecting the dots and building towards all of our safety. A devastating impact of oppression is the way that it leads us to believe that our interests and our communities are at odds or are disconnected or in competition. And so in order to successfully fight the white nationalist movement and the rise of fascism in the United States, we have to overcome this lie wherever it arises. Because anti-Semitism, like racism and other oppressions, has been used by governments around the world to prevent the emergence of multi-class, multiracial, and multi-ethnic mass movements. So the only way to combat the attacks and manipulations against our movement is relationships of solidarity. And these relationships take years to build. And I want to be really clear about this, that we say solidarity like it's a slogan, and it's not easy. It's just not. It's challenging, it's trying, it's putting the time in together year after year and showing up for each other when we get targeted and giving each other a whole lot of slack. We don't understand how each other's oppressions function, and we are all learning. So we have to face disappointments in each other and fight to connect with one another again and again, and we just can't leave the table when things get hard. We don't have that luxury anymore. And for us as Jews, building relationships of solidarity requires that we're able to discern who are the potential allies that we need to educate about anti-Semitism, and who are the people for whom anti-Semitism is so intrinsic to their ideology that it's impossible to separate. There's a fair amount of political education that we need to do to bring our non-Jewish allies in close with us, and that's just part of the work. That's part of the organizing. And when we put in that long-term work of showing up for each other, all of us, Jews and non-Jews, we can be part of the project of forging a new collective safety built on relationships and mutual solidarity that takes away the power of the right wing to use our history against us.
Great stuff, Dov. Thank you for that. I'm just you've been doing such great work recently, we've all seen it. Do you have a call to action in this moment that you would like to put out there into the world? I'm going to come back to you a little bit later, but is there anything you want to say on that right now?
Sure. There's a lot of calls to action that I'd like to make, and some of them are also going to be represented on this call. I think one of the biggest a central call that I have, and remaining on C3 lines here today on this webinar, is related to that of really being able to discern who are our potential allies and who are the people that are targeting us for their own political gains. and to, as a Jewish community, be clear about who we are fighting a shared project with. So Jews have found great safety and thriving under multi-racial, multi-ethnic, diverse communities. That is a place where there's not been a lot of them over the course of history, but where there have been and Jews have been part of them, that's been times of extraordinary flourishing of the Jewish community under all different kinds of regimes. So it's my belief and the belief of Ben the Ark that what we are fighting for is a inclusive, diverse, multiracial democracy, and that is what is going to keep Jews safe. So anyone that is fighting for that diverse, inclusive, multiracial democracy, those are our allies. Those are the people that are creating great safety with us. So whether or not those people are completely schooled on the ins and outs of anti-Semitism, whether they know or don't know like what all the tropes are, frankly, not all Jews know what all the tropes are, we need to actually be clear that we need to be building allyship with the people who are building the same shared project that we are. And that shared project is that multiracial democracy where we can thrive. So any of the work that y'all are doing in whatever ways to be building that democracy and building those partnerships and fighting alongside the people that are fighting for that same thing, that is how we build safety for us as Jews. It's not about isolation. It's about building that kind of democracy in which the Jewish community can thrive. And anyone who's out there doing that is an ally.
Thanks, Dev. That's great. There's so many actions that people can get involved in. I'm going to turn now to one of the very dramatic and effective sort of solidarity actions that's been going on in recent months. I'm going to turn to Never Again Action and Alyssa Rubin. And Alyssa, I'm going to ask you, how did Never Again Action start mobilizing the Jewish community to stand for immigration justice? And how do you see this work as crucial to ending anti-Semitism?
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I also want to thank Ben and Dov for really setting the context and the groundwork, because I think that what Never Again has been doing this summer and into the fall is really just a case study in a lot of this really, really deep thinking that's been going on. So Never Again Action started off at the end of June of this past summer as a mass mobilization of Jews against ISIS concentration camps at the border. And this response really arose out of a particular set of circumstances this summer that put Jews at the center of a debate about the immigration crisis. So if folks remember this past June, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, after visiting the concentration camps, described them, I think for the first time publicly, as concentration camps, which elicited backlash both from the political right and from some in the mainstream Jewish community, who described her statements as disrespectful to the Jews who died in concentration camps during the Holocaust. And the right really sees this opportunity to attack AOC and the progressive movement in general in the name of Jews. They weaponize this real history of Jewish trauma to continue pushing their racist and immigrant agenda, an anti-immigrant agenda. And so what we saw then was the conversation about the immigration crisis and the inhumane conditions in the camps becoming this semantic debate about whether or not it was appropriate to call the camps concentration camps and what Jews have to say on the issue, and whether or not it was anti-Semitic to use that term in reference to the crisis. And many of us in the Jewish community were horrified on two levels, both by the conditions in the camps and what was being reported on, and by the hand-wringing of the mainstream Jewish community and the way that the right was weaponizing this moment to push their agenda. A lot of us have been raised, hearing the words never again, and knowing that the Jewish community puts this at the center, puts preventing atrocities like this at the center of what it means to be Jewish. And yet when it came to this moment, there was just so much ambivalence in the conversation. And we knew that that didn't reflect the feelings of most American Jews who overwhelmingly support immigrant rights and reject Trump and ICE's policies towards immigrants. And so I think here one way that we see anti-Semitism showing up and the way it functions is to sow confusion and distraction within the progressive movement, which we saw in this kind of semantic debate this summer. And so it really posed a choice to Jews and to us, which was, were we going to allow our trauma to be used by the right to push their agenda, or take back the story and stand in solidarity with immigrants? And we decided to take action because we wanted to change that conversation. We wanted to make it clear that Jews are not interested in a semantic debate. We care about stopping the atrocities happening at the border and around the country, and refuse to let right-wing politicians who simultaneously peddle anti-Semitism and white nationalist policies also weaponize our trauma. And as Never Again Action, we see our role is using the attention that was on Jews in that moment to put the spotlight back onto the crisis, and to sound the alarm to the general public, and to really ask people to act as they believe that they would have if they were alive in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. So the first action we did was on June 30th at the Elizabeth Detention Center in New Jersey, which is just 10 miles from New York City. At that action, 36 Jews were arrested, shutting down the detention center. And in the 2 months after that, Jews, immigrants, and allies across the country took action in over 36 cities, from Boston to Chicago to Portland, Maine to Nashville and South Florida. And we estimate that anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people took action this summer. And many of those groups have continued to organize locally, building relationships with local and regional and national immigrant justice groups. So what does fighting for immigrant justice have to do with fighting anti-Semitism? As Ben and Dov mentioned, we really can't talk about fighting anti-Semitism in 2019 without talking about white nationalism and anti-immigrant racism. The forces that underlie Trump's racist and xenophobic immigration policies is part of the same ideology that inspired the Tree of Life shooters' anti-Semitic attack. And as white nationalist rhetoric grows stronger, immigrants, people of color, and Jews are going to become more and more vulnerable to those attacks. So rather than currying favor with elites and lending them cover to push their racist policies, Jews need to actively stand in solidarity with all of those targeted by white nationalism and white supremacy. And in order for us to fight anti-Semitism, we have to actually model what it looks like to make different choices, to make the choice not to stay quiet or let the right use our trauma to push their agenda, but to actually make the choice to opt out of that system and visibly stand in solidarity with the other groups that are more visibly targeted by white nationalism and white supremacy. And the last thing is that doing this work explicitly as Jews is really important, because we Jews have a stake in fighting white nationalism and white supremacy. And that's what really allows us to be in solidarity, when we see our stake as intricately and intimately tied to the liberation of all people.
Thank you, Alyssa. Now I'm going to turn to Imogen Page from Jewish Community Action. And the question that I have for Imogen is, so I'm interested in hearing about JCA's efforts in Minnesota to fight white nationalism and anti-Semitism by building coalitions between Jews and other groups across the state. How has this been challenging, and how has it been inspiring, and what have you learned?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Thank you all. It's so good to be here with all of you. And my first part of my answer to that is that actually we didn't start building those coalitions to fight white nationalism and anti-Semitism. We started building those coalitions over the 25 years that Jewish Community Action has existed to fight for affordable housing and sensible immigration justice and for bail reform. And we built those coalitions organically and intentionally by coming together with our neighbors and with community organizations around our shared values. And the result of that is that we now have relationships with these organizations and with the communities that they represent. And we can come together having already established trust and credibility with one another over the years in order to now really take on white nationalism and anti-Semitism. And we've been doing this bit by bit as we've done this other work. And it hasn't been a focus of our work until now. This year, we are launching a project around building a shared analysis of white nationalism, of anti-Semitism, and of how they undermine the left and our coalitions. And we're able to do that and build that shared analysis with progressives across the state of Minnesota because those relationships already exist. And as Dov said, you know, those can take years, and it's so essential to really be intentional about building that trust and taking the time. And it gets messy, and we are all dealing with different cultural backgrounds, different ways of relating to one another, and different traumas that impact how we relate to one another under adversity. And so it can be really challenging, but it's also absolutely necessary and deeply rewarding. And one of the partnerships that Jewish Community Action holds really dear is with CARE Minnesota. And they have been just phenomenal allies to us in times like the shooting in Pittsburgh. And we have shown up for them as well. And we show up together for causes like striking Amazon workers in Minnesota, who are majority Somali and East African. And we share an understanding that the white nationalists who bomb local mosques in Minnesota and who are currently harassing children in the playgrounds of Islamic community centers in the suburbs and running hijabi women off the road are subscribed to the same ideas as the man who a year ago walked into that synagogue in Squirrel Hill and shot 11 of our elders. And we understand that we need each other. So that's part of what is, you know, really worthwhile about these long-standing relationships, and also just deeply, deeply necessary. But we are launching this campaign now specifically to address anti-Semitism and white nationalism. We have funding for the first time to actually focus staff time on it. And we found that, you know, our partners are really desperate for this analysis. They haven't had it. And these conversations that we're having right now have not had an opportunity to sort of permeate out into the secular left and the non-Jewish left. And folks are thanking us for doing this work. We had a union representative who thanked us for taking the time to do this political education and, you know, really put in our time to help educate our allies. And they were able to then go back to their union and rewrite their materials around corporate greed and make sure that they were avoiding violent anti-Semitic tropes about Jews and money and control. So that's something that we are really proud of, and we are going to, you know, continue to do. It's challenging, especially, you know, within a really small community, such as we have in Minnesota, and it's so deeply necessary because when we are a small community, it means we need our allies and we need those relationships of solidarity all the more.
Thank you, Imogen, for that answer. There are some questions popping up in the question field. We'll try to do our best to get to them during the question and answer period. So next I'm going to go to Brandon Mond from Carolina Jews for Justice. And so, I mean, each region of the country has its own challenges. Next month will mark the 40th anniversary of the Greensboro Massacre, where 5 young labor and community activists were killed in broad daylight in North Carolina by members of the KKK and various neo-Nazis. They were supported, their efforts were supported by the police, who were as horrible as they often are. So how do you at Carolina Jews for Justice approach your education and mobilization and organizing work when it comes to anti-Semitism and white nationalism?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I just want to start out with a story I actually heard a couple summers ago from Rabbi Everett Gendler. Rabbi Everett Gendler was a really like prolific rabbi in the civil rights movement, had a really close relationship with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And he told me a story about one time visiting a southern city with Heschel, and going there for a civil rights demonstration, and getting to the airport and being greeted immediately at the airport by the local Jewish community in the southern city. And this community like asked them essentially to like turn around and get back on the plane, that they didn't want them there. You know, they said that we live here and we are in an extreme amount of danger. We're trying to lay low and you don't have to suffer the consequences of whatever you do here. And for me, especially as a Jew from Texas, that feels like a really complicated story. I think on one hand, we have to be really clear that that is a response that's steeped in white supremacy. And we have to be clear that that was a response that people were making out of a real fear that they had of a real danger that was present to them and their community. And at that time, the national Jewish community's orientation was not around supporting local Southern Jewish communities to take the lead in the efforts of campaigning for civil rights. So what happened was that these local Jewish folks were not being connected with their local struggles for justice and safety, and other marginalized, and not connected with the other marginalized communities that were being threatened by these white nationalist forces. The isolation led to a let's keep our head down strategy for white Jews for safety that still operates in a lot of Southern Jewish communities. Now, this is obviously a generalization and not meant to speak for every single community. For example, many of the activists, the white activists in the Greensboro that were there during the day of the Greensboro massacre were Jewish. But I think it's useful to talk about these larger trends when trying to understand the multiplicity of lineages that we're doing this work in. Today, we have an opportunity to make that choice again. Southern Jews are still geographically proximate to these dangerous forces. And so the question that we're trying to ask ourselves is, what would it look like if we could move through our fear, join with other marginalized communities, and fight like hell? One of our leaders told me that when her family moved to Chapel Hill in 1995, they were visited by the Klan, told to get away. People's fear and trauma are still really real. And so we at Carolina Jews for Justice are thinking a lot about what it would take in North Carolina and more broadly the South to support Jews in staying in the fights they need to stay in. We've started to understand that folks need to feel like they are in deep relationship with each other and with folks in other Southern cities that are doing the same work. Folks need training, and they also need more resources. This summer, we brought together a crew of our leaders from across North Carolina and some from a couple other places in the South to give them a deep connection and political education they need to play a part in helping move our community into action. Since then, 4 different workshops for the Jewish community have been held in Chapel Hill, in Asheville, and in Atlanta on the intersections of white supremacy, white nationalism, and anti-Semitism. A nascent Jewish organizing effort in Nashville, Tennessee was also born out of this retreat. In short, things are moving. And I just want to talk briefly with the time remaining about one of the many ways we try to combat white nationalism once we do move people into action. This example being our local and statewide campaigns for economic justice. We know that economic equality is bad. We believe it's bad because of the structural violence it creates for poor and working class people. And that group includes parts of our Jewish community. There are 2 million people in North Carolina who are working for a poverty wage, many others who are unemployed. Countless people in our state suffer from food and housing insecurity. And that is a huge problem on its own merits. And it's also a huge problem because when white nationalists see that, they see a humongous opportunity. People are hurting, and we know that wealth inequality is a breeding ground for white nationalism. That although people's conditions are caused by oppressive forces like white supremacy and capitalism, anti-Semitism functions as a way of obscuring those forces that are causing devastation in these folks' lives. It's much easier to explain that Jews control the economy and are to blame than talking about the failure of neoliberal economic policy. So we as Carolina Jews for Justice try to take us out of the realm of discourse and disrupt the narrative by actively engaging in cross-class and multiracial coalition work. Whether it's Fight for 15 in Durham, the Housing Justice Coalition in Charlotte, or the Health Equity Coalition in Asheville and the rural counties surrounding it. When we show up as Jews in those struggles for living wages, access to healthcare, or generally in the fight for economic justice, two things happen. The first is that if we understand that economic inequality is a breeding ground for white nationalist organizing, we have a self-interest, even those of us who are not poor or working class, in fighting for a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources. And the second is that showing up as Jews in those fights destabilizes the white nationalist ideology that paints us as enemies.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm going to go back to Dov for a quick question. If you would, Dov. This is the context of sort of the both sides issue. Anti-Semitism comes from both sides, the left and the right. There have been many prominent examples of this being put out into the world. And of course, there's an element of truth to it. But how do you respond to that when clearly what we're talking about tonight is about the impact of anti-Semitism within white nationalism?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So there's a few things I'll say. One is that all anti-Semitism is dangerous and it doesn't matter who it's coming from. But that the American Jewish community suffers from a kind of both-sidism. Instead of seeing anti-Semitism as part of the political project of the far right, as we've talked about today, versus an issue that needs to be solved within the left. And that we need to help our community understand this difference. Part of that is about being really clear about where we are and what time it is. So not making false connections or equivalences between the anti-Semitism of leftist regimes in other parts of the world 30 or 40 years ago to today, and actually really recognizing what political movements look like in the US today and what is aligning them. Another piece that I just think is really important for us to know is, this has been talked about by different folks on the panel, but is that anti-Semitism is rarely just about Jews, that it impacts Jews, but usually its usage is not actually about Jews at all, that it's a political tool and it's a weapon. And so one of the things that came out, I think it was last year, the Republican officials and strategists have said publicly that leading up to the 2020 election, they're going to try to paint the Democratic Party as socialists, anti-Semites, and baby killers. Okay, they're trying to make Democrats seem like left-wing crazies who will destroy the American economy, murder babies, unborn babies, and turn a blind eye to violence against Jews. So they have literally said this, and so we need to take them at their word. So looking at the accusations that have come at progressive leaders in the House of Representatives, you know, these new progressive leaders are a direct threat to the Republican agenda. When it comes to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Rashida Tlaib, members who identify as democratic socialists and who have amassed significant power in just a few months, they are a deep threat to the financial elite. So these progressive leaders, because of all their power and potential, are targets. And accusations of anti-Semitism are extremely effective strategies to take down progressive leaders, particularly people of color, particularly Muslim people. And this is in part because anti-Semitism intersects with racism and Islamophobia. There is a story that says that people of color and Muslims are more anti-Semitic than white people and Christians. And this is a story that white supremacy tells us. And the same white supremacy tells us a story that white Jews are more racist than other white people. So our communities are regularly set up against each other. And so it's believable to the general public when people of color and Muslims are accused of anti-Semitism. It sticks in a way that it doesn't stick when white Christians are accused of anti-Semitism. So a really clear example is that Kevin McCarthy used blatant anti-Semitism in his social media during the election, basically claiming that George Soros and 2 other people of Jewish descent were trying to buy the election. A day later, George Soros' house received a bomb threat. McCarthy left the tweet up for days, even with repeated calls for him to take it down because of threats of real violence against the Soros family. And Kevin McCarthy was one of the lead people to attack Ilhan Omar and later other progressive members of Congress for anti-Semitism. So this is a campaign, and it's a campaign on many fronts. It's a campaign to discredit leaders of color. It's a campaign to discredit the new progressive leadership in our country. It's a campaign against the Democratic Party. And in some ways, it's also a campaign to pull the Jewish community away from the Democratic Party. Jews vote over 76% Democrat, have for many years. So in some swing states like Florida, shifting that vote or getting Jews to just stay home on voting day could mean winning the election. And so just going back to where I started, you'll notice that none of this has much to do with Jews. Jews are not being served by these campaigns to weaponize anti-Semitism. In fact, it puts us at greater risk by alienating us from our allies, crying wolf at a time when white nationalists are literally gunning down Jews in our synagogues, and confusing the general public about what anti-Semitism is and is not. And so going back to one of the points I made before, like, do I think that all these progressive leaders have no anti-Semitism in them whatsoever? No, I don't. Like, as a white person who knows that I have been fed racism since the time I was little, just by living in this society, non-Jews have been fed anti-Semitism in the same way. And like Imogen was saying, from like partners that JCA has been working with, when like progressives are learning about anti-Semitism, I can tell you also from trainings I've done, they are shocked by some of this content. This is like some of the understandings of how anti-Semitism works, what the tropes are. This is very new information to a lot of people that we can teach our progressive partners. And we know that it takes a long time to unlearn racism and unlearn anti-Semitism and unlearn these oppressions, right? I can't just go to one workshop on racism and be like, well, I no longer have racism at all in me. So this is just, it's ongoing learning, it's ongoing training we have to do with our partners. But again, it goes back to being able to discern, like, who are the progressive partners who probably have some anti-Semitism that we need to work on them with, like, for sure, and who are the leaders who are actually weaponizing Jewish pain, who are scaring the shit out of our communities and then pointing the finger at Black and brown leaders and saying they're the ones who are responsible for your insecurity. Though that is the threat that we have coming at us right now. And there's a major difference from the right and the left. And we as a Jewish community need to get really, really clear in our ability to discern.
Thank you, Dev. We'll come to Q&A in just a few minutes. First, we have one final speaker. That is Grisa Martinez from United We Dream. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. In the last year, I mean, not that these things haven't always happened, but in the last year, we've seen mass shootings in El Paso, as well as at Tree of Life and other places. Also, we've seen, bigotry in the White House. We see scapegoating of George Soros and saying that he's the one who's driving the migrant caravan. They're not people, looking for a better life. How do you understand the connections between anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant racism, and the other kinds of issues that we've been talking to tonight? And maybe you could talk a little bit about your work at United We Dream and their vision for freedom for immigrants.
Thanks so much for having me, Stephen. Can you hear me okay? I'm in the room with organizers prepping for massive walkouts in the next couple of weeks, so you might hear them sort of in the background. I am really honored to be with you tonight. My name is Grisa Martinez Rosas, and I serve as a Deputy Executive Director of United We Dream. I'm undocumented, unafraid, and ready to keep fighting. I was thinking a lot about this question, which is a really big one, Stephen, that you just laid out. And, I'm obviously surrounded by people that are experts in this field. And what is true to me and to the work that we do at United We Dream is that the connections are not just like the forces that we deal with every day, the anti-immigrant sentiments, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness that shows up in our work, but rather for me, it shows up the strongest in the fight for the vision that we want for this country. The unity about ensuring that everyone has a safe place to sleep every night. Everyone has the ability to take care of their kids and raise a family in the way that they would want to, and being able to stay where you want to and move whenever you want to, I think is some of the pieces that connect us and all of us in this moment. And the places where I think immigrants like myself are feeling the challenges of this moment, and how white nationalism and anti-Semitism, as Delph was just explaining, are showing up, is really with the growth and the manipulation and the murders brought on to us by ICE and CBP. I'm gonna put a link on the chat just now. United We Dream has been tracking the abuse of ICE and CBP agents. These are folks that are paid by our tax dollars, that are empowered by this president and presidents before him to go into our homes in the middle of the night, snatch us from our beds and put us in detention centers, or kill us while we're there, or deport us and separate us from our family. And I think that for us in this moment, to be able to see the Never Again actions, the work that all of you are doing to be able to really center immigrants and what is really at stake, I think it's really important to us. And it's been, I can say, life affirming of why I chose to do this work each and every day, to know that I'm not alone in being undocumented, and I'm not alone in being a woman of color in this country, but that people are gonna show up. I'll tell you that we have had many campaigns since Trump was elected to be able to bring about a different reality for this country. And one of the ones that stands super clear in my mind, we were down at the border when the ICE agents and CBP agents were detaining children were just detaining children at the border. And we had this big action, like hundreds of people showed up, we shut down the border, it was great, like tons of chanting. And as I went to the airport, I was pulled from a line and I was detained by CBP agents who said to me, like, I can't even repeat a lot of the anti-Semitic sentiments that they use to refer to the fight for immigrants, the way that they said that I didn't deserve to be in this country, and like really questioned my humanity. And in that moment, it's like the most worst case scenario in any immigrant's life, to be detained by CBP and agents, and for them to tell you straight to your face, we're just waiting for ICE agents to come to detain you and then deport you. And in that moment, I always played it hundreds of times in my brain growing up, like, what would I do? How would I react? What would I feel? And what I felt was peace. I don't know exactly where it came from, but I know what informed it was this deep belief in my bones that someone was gonna come for me, that the folks at Bend the Arc and all of the work that we had done together, the folks at Never Again would probably shut down a detention center, and the folks at United We Dream will like show up with our orange shirts and take up any airport in any space, because I am lucky to be an organizer. I am lucky to be out and unafraid, and someone was gonna say something. And in my head, I was like, okay, I'm gonna give my team 2 months to launch this campaign, and then I'm gonna sign my deportation papers, because I might not last there too long. The egregious circumstances in which immigrants are there are force people to sign their own deportation papers. And so I said, I'll do that. I'll go to Mexico and see my dad, who was deported 10 years ago. And then I'll go to Canada, and then I'll figure out a way to keep fighting. And so when I think about all of the attacks that you all have laid out, and the real danger that we live in every day when we walk out of the door, when we go to synagogue, when we go to our places of worship, when we go to school, the thing that keeps me going is the ability to be able to lay out a hopeful future. Where a future where we can envision white nationalism no longer existing, where we can really like feel in our bones that we have done the work to combat anti-Semitism in our work and anti-Blackness in everywhere and everything that we do. And so United We Dream has been really busy in being able to lay out our vision for how do we get to that place faster. So we've convened immigrant rights folks for about, I think now about a year, and we've come out with the 5 freedoms. And the 5 freedoms really are at the core is a belief that all people have inherent dignity and value, that everyone should be able to live safe in healthy conditions, protected equally under the law, that every human being deserves to embrace their complex histories and backgrounds, to dream, to love, to imagine, and achieve peace and liberation. We believe that migration policies must be grounded in racial, economic, and gender equity and justice. And so our 5 freedoms are the freedom to transform, the freedom to move, the freedom to thrive, the freedom to stay, and the freedom to work. And that really frames, you know, when folks come to us and talk to us about, well, how are you talking about anti-Semitic sentiments within like immigrant communities themselves? And how do you talk about anti-Blackness sentiments in our homes and in the people that we love and on ourselves? That's the framework that we use in moving forward. And so, you know, I'm really grateful for the work that PRA has done in putting this research together to really be able to not only talk about like the fluffy things about, you know, all of us could talk on end about like how white nationalism shows up, but to be able to really see it broken down for all of us has been, like, I think for us really exciting to be able to go back into our membership and say, this is where it is, this is how do we confront it together. So, you know, one of the things that still stands really closely in my life and the way that I do this work, and I want to end with this, is that I wish that I could say that I have the certainty that tomorrow I will get up and I'll be able to go to work and go to school and go back to my job without being under threat of deportation. I really wish that was the case, but that isn't the case today. But what I do know deep in my bones is that the work that Dove and Brandon and Imogen and Elisa and Stephen that you're doing, and the folks that are on this call, is to be able to come to with ourselves and the truths about our surroundings, and to be able to not only mount a counter force against those pieces, but rather to be able to forge a new pathway forward. And to be able to forge a pathway that is not in response to what they are putting out there, but rather in a proactive vision of what we want and what all of our people deserve. So United We Dream will continue to track down these agents that are coming into our home. We will continue to shut down detention centers. And above it all, we will continue to lay out what we believe is and what we call joyful rebellion, which is to say that I will live my life with the idea that one day I will be able to go hug my dad, that I will be able to go and see all of the beautiful lands that are up on my desktop, and that we will do that together, and that in the struggle we will be able to speak to all of the anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant sentiments that live within all of us. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the work that you are doing. Thank you for being on this call really late. I'm really grateful for that. And I think we're gonna win.
We're going to win. I love that sentiment. Thank you so much, Grisa, for being on the call, for being with us tonight. Thank you, everyone who's been on the call. I'm going to throw out some questions that have come from our audience. And I'll pose them to someone, but if a different panelist would like to sort of raise their hand and jump in on it, that would also be okay. So the first question I have, from our audience, how do we start breaking down the conversation that we're having here tonight when we're not talking to, when we're talking to a white audience, a Christian audience, or at least a non-Jewish audience? And this, of course, could be asked in a whole bunch of different contexts. So maybe I will pose, I will throw this first to Dov.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the question was like, how do we talk about this with white, non-Jewish audiences? Yeah, that's a great question. I'm assuming that it's coming also because it's not the same frame that we've been using around like all targeted communities together. So I think one of the things that I found really powerful in like white anti-racist learning on like the long journey that I've been on is around just how much we lose our humanity through being in the role of oppressor. And being able to like really understand ally work as a means of fighting to get our humanity back and like fighting to be able to have our full humanity again. And so I think in that way, there's a really clear connection for all of us, whether we are in the positions of being targeted or being the oppressor in any of these different configurations, of that actually oppression steals all of our humanity and makes all of us less able to be our full selves and less able to be in like full connection with other human beings. So I think that it's really that's like a level that we can be talking with our white Christian allies about all of us fighting to get our humanity back, whether our humanity is like, as Grisa was saying, like the ability to like be fully present with our loved ones, or whether our humanity is actually being able to like feel more of our heart instead of having it be cut off because we just like have to get through our day and can't listen to the news in a particular way. So I think that like that's one of the pieces that we can do. The other piece is just the way in which we all can be positioned to be really powerful in the positions we're in. Like whatever our positionality is in these fights, like there's a ton of power there. So I feel like if we can be really working in deep solidarity where folks who are kind of checking the box of every like, you know, privilege or whatever can actually be empowered to take like really bold action and have us at their backs being like, yes, like do it, we are with you, we are in this alongside you, then there's like extraordinary moves that our movements can make. So I think it's one of the pieces about really creating an opportunity for belonging for anybody in our movement work, because the multiple positionality is what's going to make us most effective.
Great. Anyone else want to take a crack at that? Talking to
Stephen, you muted yourself. But I just want to add one simple thing. I think that what Dev said was absolutely brilliant, and I would just add that like the non-Jewish white how we talk to them, I don't think is monolithic. I think there's a lot about like what is the class positionality of this audience as well, because one of the things about the like interlocking of white supremacy and anti-Semitism as systems of oppression is it's meant to keep like poor white people. It's meant to keep an economic system in place. That economic system is capitalism, which is supposed to like obfuscate the roots of like why poor white people are poor. And it's supposed to pit them against communities of color and immigrants and Jews. And I think that being able to make those connections for your audience, depending on their class position, could also be really powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see what else we have here. Questions are coming in a very various formats. Maybe Grisa, could you maybe talk a little bit about when you get resistance from people on a particular issue that are your allies or your colleagues, people who you think are going to be there, whether that's like, you know, anti-Semitism or anti-Black racism or dealing with women's issues, whatever it is in the communities where you organize. How do you personally deal with that?
That's a great question. I think Dove touched on this earlier, but this idea that you go into one webinar in the middle of the week, or you go into one workshop and you're done, I think is one that we must dispel within our movement, because I believe that solidarity and being able to undo the stuff that we swim in it every single day. It's a practice and a lifelong commitment. I think that, at United We Dream, we are queer led, we are women led, and to be able to see the connection between all of those identities, also there's a lot of learning that we're doing. And so personally, I'm the daughter of a Southern Baptist preacher, and so the word grace often comes up in my head, and being able to extend that to one another, and also be able to be really clear about what is acceptable within your space and your group and what isn't, and what are the accountability mechanisms. At United We Dream, we just started a restorative justice circle within our teams to make sure that we're dealing with all of these things as they're coming up, but being able to come at it from a place of wanting to learn together, and be able to hold each other accountable. I think that, in this moment where everything is about distracting us from the way that Donald Trump is wanting to really literally kill people of color and expel anyone that does not believe with his worldview and is not white, it is easy to then be able to be super nitpicky about the differences and not be able to differentiate between a learning curve and a deep philosophical difference. And for organizers like us, it is going to have to be really important to have the discernment to know the difference, and honestly be able to say, this is the thing that I'm going to deal with today, this ICE and CBP agent at my home, and then we'll go to the lifelong lessons that we need to do to undo, to be able to tackle how does Palestine play into our work of working with across our segments of the progressive movement, and how do we make sure that we show up and acknowledge that the ways that immigrants are treated in this country and the way that ICE and CBP operate are also showing up in other places across the globe. So that's a little bit about how we think about it, but honestly, it's just whatever you would want to have done to you whenever you fuck up, you mess up in the moment, I think it's going to be important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Grisa. I'm going to have to do one more question, and maybe I'll throw this to Imogen or Alyssa, one of you who maybe hasn't spoken yet and might want to jump on this. But it's following from Dove's point earlier about staying at the table when things get rough. And the question asks, from your experience, have you run into this when things get rough, and how do you strengthen your capacity for continuing to do work in solidarity even when you run into difficulties, disagreements?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. We're in a moment where we all have so much learning to do, and we're trying to do it all at once. And I think that sometimes it's very hard to afford ourselves a little bit of grace and patience as we mess up and trip and learn and grow. And when I'm frustrated that I have to explain a concept of some anti-Semitic trope that somebody who meant very well and is really dedicated to joint liberation has employed once again, and I'm like, God, this is the 10th time this week that this has happened, and I'm really, really sick of having this conversation. I think back to all the times that people have been gentle and gracious with me as I have, with their help, unlearned some of the racism and the transphobia and the internalized misogyny that I was raised with, and quite frankly, the internalized anti-Semitism as well. And the idea that, we owe each other a little bit of patience, but there is also, and Dove spoke to this a little bit, an idea that, people show us who they are. And we have this job of figuring out, you know, when somebody messes up and causes harm and, you know, is brought to their attention, how do they respond? Are they so invested in their anti-Semitism? Are they so, you know, deeply dug into this as a piece of like white nationalist ideology that they are not interested in coming back from it? Or are they someone who's going to engage in good faith and who we can, you know, work together with? And we have a responsibility, I think, to give our partners in other marginalized communities, at least in the beginning, the benefit of the doubt that we have so often been afforded by them.
Can I add one thing?
Please do.
Yes, to all of that. And I think one thing that I consistently return to is the knowledge that one of the ways that anti-Semitism functions is to like cause confusion. And by its nature, the confusion that it causes is what allows it to work. And so while that is frustrating and can be really painful, I think it's something really important to remember that when people are confused and maybe not getting it, and maybe when we as Jews ourselves aren't getting it, that's anti-Semitism doing its job. And that there's not even like a full comprehensive and aligned understanding of anti-Semitism in the Jewish community. And so we really as a community have a lot of work to do in understanding the ways that anti-Semitism is being weaponized, and the way that different stories about what anti-Semitism is are being told, so that we can feel ownership over what this thing is, so that we can bring it to other people. And if we're not able to do the work and fight for ourselves, then it's really hard to ask other people to do that for us.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left. So in order to stay on track as best we can, I'm going to ask each of you to give a concluding comment in about 1 minute, saying what your most important takeaway for people is today. And maybe start back with Ben, and we'll just go back through.
Yeah, it's been so inspiring to hear, you know, everyone's wisdom and the lessons and the learning that we're all like taking from the work that we're doing across the country. And I guess the thing that keeps, you know, coming back to me, like the theme that's reappeared a lot, especially in this, you know, Q&A, is the importance of really sticking together and coming back to the table again and again, even when it's hard. I think, you know, anti-Semitism has done a great job of dividing, you know, the majority of Jews in this country from a lot of justice movements for a while, sowing seeds of division within and between various movements for justice in various, you know, communities. And we're at a point where we're all seeing that we're all in this together, and we're taking really strong steps of building, and in some cases rebuilding, a lot of the strong you know, deeply rooted coalitions that have, you know, been unraveled over the last several decades. And so it's really inspiring and empowering and humbling for me to just hear hear the lesson over and over again that, you know, it's hard. All of us are gonna, you know, mess up in our work of unlearning all of the various oppressions that we've been taught to internalize, and that we've, you know, been complicit in, and that we've, you know, experienced upon us. But like, this work is beautiful, and it's, you know, long work. It's often slow work, but we're all in it together, and we're here for each other, and that's what I'm taking away. So thank you all for showing me that lesson.
And then Dove, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think the summary is just really how all of us want lives of freedom and fairness and belonging. And right now, certain politicians and corporate interests, which we didn't touch as much about, so just want to make sure we're mentioning that, are really using fear to divide us against each other for their own gain and to create a country that's really only for themselves. And so they're putting Jewish people's lives in danger by blaming us for problems and using ugly rhetoric that leads directly to violence against our multiracial Jewish family, and then pointing the finger at Black and brown people for making Jews feel afraid and keeping us from working together to win the things that we all need to thrive. So it's really up to us to building the future that we know that we need, as we've been talking about, joining together across difference and building a country that's for all of us, no matter what.
And go to Alyssa.
I think I would say that we can't fight anti-Semitism by keeping our heads down or by trying to curry favor with those in power. And the best way that we can fight anti-Semitism and white nationalism in this moment is by standing up visibly as Jews and taking action in solidarity, both against anti-Semitism and against all forms of oppression.
Thank you. And Imogen?
Thank you all so much. And all I really want to say is that I really believe that things thrive when we care for them, and that all of this organizing work, needs to be supported. And so if, I believe that the path to safety for all of us and, a thriving multiracial democracy starts with us putting our resources, into these organizations and into this organizing, whether that's the organizations that we work for or supporting the people who are taking really, really serious risks in order to protect these democratic ideals. And it's essential. So thank you all for the investment you've made tonight.
And Brandon?
Thanks. I think all the people who just came before me did a really, really excellent job of summing that up. What's coming up for me is I just want to lift up the name of Dr. Michael Nathan. We talked about the Greensboro massacre earlier on this call, and he was one of the 5 anti-racist organizers that was murdered by the Klan 40 years ago in Greensboro. And just to lift up his name to recognize that as people doing this work, as Jews doing this work, it's really heavy, but we are coming from a lineage of fighters and resistors. And just that we can be scared at times, and the work is hard, but we can look back to our lineage to for some comfort and support.
And Grisa?
I have 3 asks of you tonight. The first one is to join us in calling for our members of Congress to stop giving money to ICE and CBP, those that jail us, deport us, and kill us in their detention camps. The second one is to join us November 8th and November 12th. The Supreme Court is considering whether DACA recipients like myself and about 1 million others would be put into threat of deportation again by Trump and using the Supreme Court. And so we have to say hell no. So we're doing walkouts November 8th and November 12th and like building up. So you can check out United We Dream on Twitter and everywhere else to get more information on that. And then the third one, the third asset I'll make of you, and I'll make it from my heart, is I think that being able to reclaim the joy of this moment, that I've been doing this work for 10 years. And I just never thought that I would be on a conference call or conference like this one with you all, and really being able to hear both affirming messages of being seen as an undocumented woman of color in this country, and seeing all of our futures and our joys tied together. I would have just never imagined that growing up as an organizer in Texas. And so I think being able to in Spanish, you say aferrarnos, to be able to hold on to that joy in this next couple of years, and to ensure that we hold on to the spirit, even if there is a Democrat in the White House, and even more so in that moment, because what we are unearthing together is really the things that is going to ensure that all of us feel like what we have, what we need to be safe, and all of us are liberated, and not letting go of it because a different political parties in the White House, because we've been going through this for decades and generations. And if you will allow me, there's this song that is a poem by June Jordan, and it's sang better, I think, and you're gonna have to bear with my voice a little bit, but I want to share it with you. But because we use it in the places when we feel the most tired, when we feel like, what the hell is all of this worth for? We use it in moments like this, and I wanted to just share that with you. It's June Jordan. She's a Black immigrant poem, and she says, "We have come too far. We won't turn around. We'll flood the streets with justice. We are freedom bound." And I really do believe that. Thank you so much for having us, and thanks so much for joining our fight.
Thank you, Grisa. Thank you, everyone. I hate to follow that, but I'll give my takeaway, which is this: if you want to fight anti-Semitism, fight anti-Semitic ideas and anti-Semitic policies. If you want to fight racism, fight anti-racist policies and anti-racist ideas. If you want to fight anti-immigrant bigotry, fight anti-immigrant ideas and anti-immigrant policies. If you want to win, we've got to do it together. We don't have a choice. Thank all of you so much. Everyone on this call, everyone on the panel, you've been great, and it's been an honor to be your moderator tonight. And good evening.